Good day to you. When you think about Mexican food, what do you think about? You think about tacos, probably, right? Perhaps a burrito? Perhaps an enchilada? If your knowledge is greater, maybe you're thinking about a tostada, a gordita, a fajito, a taquito, nachos. I'm talking about a lot of Mexican dishes that we know about in the United States. All of them are involving the tortilla, the corn tortilla. What I learned last night when my wife and I went to a cooking class with a Mexican woman in her house, very modest house. She cooked us a meal with the most amazing taste. She spent 5 hours with us, teaching us how to cook Mexican food. And one of the foods that she cooked was not actually the tortilla. One of the foods that she cooked, in fact, the whole evening revolved around it, was chili, the chili pepper. Most Americans think of the chili pepper as having to do with hot, as being really spicy, like a jalapeno pepper. But in fact, that's only one of many different types of chili, including our green pepper, which is actually a chili pepper that we eat in the States. But there's a ton more chili peppers here in Mexico. And what I learned last night during our cooking class was that the chili pepper is indigenous to Mexico. It's only from Mexico. And what happened was during the Spanish colonial times, where Spain controlled all of the trading that was done by all of its colonies, all of its properties, including Mexico, is it organized a trade route between Manila, the Philippines, and Mexico. And that trade route brought ships that were part of the Spanish Armada, the Spanish fleet that was sailing around the world. It brought ships all the way to Mexico from the Far East. And when those ships arrived in Mexico, they started to export that chili, which is grown here in Mexico, many different kinds of chili, all over the world. So the chili went to the Philippines and then to the Far East in places like India, where the chili is widely used today. If you eat hot food, if you like hot, spicy food, and I can't handle it, it's all because of the chili pepper. If it was not for the Mexican chili pepper, we would not have hot food around the world. So that chili pepper became a kind of an early dimension of globalization, if you will, where it was going all over the world. And it's responsible not just for hot foods, it's responsible for coloring. Like if you get red rice, for example, that's through the coloring of the chili pepper. The chili is coloring clothes as well. They have green chilies, yellow chilies, red chilies. The chili pepper is an amazing vegetable. It can also be dried. You dry it, and then you take it wherever you want, or you store it. You can store it for up to a year, and then you hydrate it again, and all of the tastes come right back into the chili pepper. I was amazed. And that trade route between the Manilas and Mexico actually worked both ways. When you think of the spice, or the herb, I should say, cilantro, do you know that one? It's in the family of parsley. You're probably thinking to yourself, wow, that's really Mexican cilantro. No, it's not. It's from the Far East. It is an example of an herb that was brought into Mexico because of that trade route, which, by the way, ended up in Mexico in Acapulco. That's where the trade route was for this early Spanish globalization of spices, which is just about 6 hours south of where I am here in Mazatlan. You know, in Mazatlan, they have this famous mountain. It's not really a mountain. It's like a peak that comes out of the ground. And it's a special landmark here because of the shape of it. It's a rock shelf. It kind of looks like a living being, a living creature that's looking up at the sky. And guess what the nickname of this mountain is? It's Godzilla. It's Godzilla. Yeah, the Japanese horror fiction, sometimes cartoon, sometimes Hollywood movie Godzilla. You know, Godzilla, the creature that stomps all over the earth, prehistoric. So I'm beginning class today talking about trade routes. I'm talking about trade routes under the Spanish colony. And I'm now making the point, how did Godzilla, a Japanese invention, end up as a name of a mountain in Mexico? It's because the Godzilla franchise, the media content of Godzilla was spread to Mexico just like the chili was spread to the rest of the world. So we're taking on today Japan. We're taking on an island, our second island. We've looked at the UK. We're taking on Japan. We're taking on in specifically the globalization of its culture It's a kind of a different chapter than what we've looked at before. It has a different focus. I'm going to branch off from some of what the chapter is talking about to make some larger points here. And I want to do that right now because I learned that last night that Mexico is one of four countries out of 200 in the world that has been designated by the United Nations as having a special status because of its food. The special status is an intangible contribution to humanity as cultural heritage. Amazing, intangible contribution to humanity through its cultural heritage because of the tortilla, because of the chili, and a lot of other different Mexican foods that you don't even really realize you might be eating, but they're coming from Mexico. The other three countries are China, India, and guess what the fourth one is? It's Japan. It's Japan because of its clean sushi cuisine. These are intangible. You can't feel and hold them there. You can't measure them. They're contributions to all of humanity coming from these four countries, which was designated by UNESCO. So this provides a way for us to take a look at Japan as being in a kind of club with Mexico, and it also introduces the idea of Japanese culture because Japanese media policy and regulation is very interested in promoting Japanese culture through its media export. So we're taking on Japan, and you probably know about Japanese media content, right? You probably know about manga. Do you know about manga? Do you know about anime? They're both very cartoon-like. They tell stories. Sometimes anime is soft porn. It's made for adults. And then, of course, you know about gaming, right? You're probably playing video games that are originating from Japan, or the format is originating from Japan. So you probably know already a lot about Japan, and you know, who could mention Japan without mentioning Pokemon? So Japan has been very successful for a tiny island, and I do think it helps again to talk about some history with Japan before we dig more deeply into the chapter. You know, Japan's an island. It's got an island mentality. It's unto itself. It must not depend on anybody else, just like St. Croix, just like Puerto Rico, just like the United Kingdom. There's an island mentality when you live on an island. You feel both vulnerable and you feel strong. You feel both dependent on the rest of the world and you feel independent. You feel both like the member of the human race, but you also feel different and individual because you're on an island, and that's Japan. And Japan was at war with the United States in World War II, right? It was part of the German Axis powers with Italy, and Pearl Harbor was a result of an attack on the United States. So why is this relevant? It's because after World War II, the United States became, it converted Japan from an enemy into a working partner. The road was not pretty. The United States dropped the only 2 atom bombs that have ever been dropped in the history of the world, dropped on Japan to end the war. But after the war, and that tragedy of proportions that can't even be described in words, after the war, Japan was set up on an American-based economic model. Japan was set up by General MacArthur from the U.S., and he set up Japan to be a capitalistic country like the United States, highly capitalistic, with many of the same ideas behind funding things through advertising and commercial sales. And so Japan became a powerhouse after World War II. A lot of money was poured into Japan to rebuild it, and to rebuild it on an American model. And that's why you get these monstrous companies like Sony, which are on this island of Japan, and they're exporting those programs to all over the world. So that's why, to dig now more deeply into the chapter material, that's why Japan, unlike Canada, unlike France, even though it is besieged by American culture, we have a lot of American culture that's been going over to Japan, and vice versa, even though they're under threat constantly from American content dominating their media landscape, they don't have any quotas like France or like Quebec in Canada. They don't have any quotas saying certain amount of programming has to be Japanese to stop the flood of cultural imperialism. And that's very interesting, and in part it's because Japan has a lot of confidence because it's an island with an island mentality of being able to combat American programming by creating its own programming. That's much of what this chapter is about. In fact, most of the media regulation in Japan is not about trying to enforce rules and prevent things from happening. Like in the United States, we try to prevent obscenity in broadcasting. We tried to prevent the glamorization of violence, although some of you may not agree with that, in American content. We try to prevent that through our regulations. In Japan, regulations are more about trying to create an artistic environment so that Japanese media content can be created that is local, that is regional, East Asian, and that can be exported across the world. And in fact, what the Japanese have become very good at, which is probably the most central theme of the chapter, is they have done very good at localizing globalization. Global localization, they kind of invented the term. And they borrowed a farming term from Japan to describe it, the jakakuka. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but that's a farming term saying you're living on your own land, so you learn to grow things according to your local conditions. You don't grow things like they're grown elsewhere. And that's why the chili pepper has taken on many different forms across the world that are no longer Mexican. It's because chili pepper is being grown according to local conditions. And that's the way the Japanese media policy has been formulated as well. It's to take the idea from another country in terms of media content and then to localize it through its own format. So Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? That's a great example of a TV show that was produced in the United States, but then it was localized by Japan. And the term that the book uses to describe this is Japan is very good at appropriating U.S. programming, taking it and giving it a new meaning. So imports from the rest of the world were very high, and in particularly America, imports coming into Japan, television, radio, film especially, very high during the 1960s. But Japan has since, through its media policy, created a much more robust local industry. And Sony has been one of the leaders in this. They are the ones that actually started to use the phrase in their own company policy, global localization. So we can see Japanese programs that are all over the world that you may not even realize, like the Iron Chef. We're speaking about food today. Japan, one of those 4 countries protected by UNESCO. UNESCO is that branch of the United Nations. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier. United Nations Economic, Science, and if it's a branch of the United Nations designed to preserve cultural heritage, Japan's one of those 4 countries. So a show like Iron Chef, which you can see on the Food Network, that's coming from Japan. Japanese directors are being embraced by Hollywood. Hollywood is bringing Japanese directors, so we're not only seeing the exporting of media content, we're seeing the exporting of media professionals, the exporting of media talent, if you will. And Japan has also done well to foster a regional growth in Asian media. So Japan works with other countries, Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan. They share resources and they produce content together and they exchange content. The chapter talks about the Korean wave. You know, I think my wife was a little bit ahead of her time, so to speak, in terms of audience habits in the U.S. She was watching Korean dramas, I'm going to say like 6 years ago. I don't know how she found them. Every night at bed, she'd be watching them just about on Netflix, Korean dramas. This is part of the Korean wave. There's been a proliferation of Korean dramas that have been produced and exported across the world and embraced. One of the most popular films that was co-produced in the East Asia region, we're talking about regionalization now of Japanese content. One of the most popular films was the Seven Swords. So Japan, through its media policy, through funding, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a government agency, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan actually appointed a cartoon character called Doraemon, popular character, maybe you know about it, as an ambassador for Japan. Appointed a Japanese media creation, a cartoon, an animation, to travel all around the world in the form of media programming to try to promote Japan as a cool culture. And this was a really interesting section of the chapter. I thought it deviated very much from the other chapters. It started to get into the meaning of a country adopting another country's values to help promote its media products. So what we're talking about here is Japan has adopted a Western value of looking cool. That's a Western value, looking cool. Sunglasses, your body posture, the watch that you're wearing, the hairstyle that you have, the way that you're handling emotional situations. We have that as part of an American value that's been portrayed in media since James Dean. You know, James Dean, the actor, named as the cool guy. Never said a word, never showed emotion. You just had a look. We're very much about that. Much of our advertising is designed to get people to purchase things based on the assumption that it will make them cooler. And so Japan has borrowed this value. And the book calls it a Western gaze. It's like what Japan is looking for is the West to look at Japan and say, that country is really cool. Really cool. And so that's why you get Japanese comic books going all over the world. That's why you get a film like Ghost in the Shell going all over the world. That's why you got Super Mario. I thought it was an Italian video game. It's a Japanese video game, Super Mario, going all over the world. Pokemon and anime and the list goes on and on. When I was a kid, there were a ton of cartoons. There was Speed Racer was one of them, Marine Boy. There were all these animated series in the 60s that were coming out of Japan. Japan, for a tiny country and an island, no less, has been very successful at both taking this idea of a format, of exporting a format, and also importing a format. It's taking an idea from an American game show like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and then making it Japanese with local content, local flavor, and local jokes, and local people. At the same time, exporting the format to other countries, the format of anime, the format of Pokemon, a game that you play. It's not just media content, it's a game that you participate in. That's what Japan has done very, very well at. It's taking the idea of not necessarily media content as a form of globalizing culture, but the format, the basic structure of the content, and marketing that. It's like when you watch almost any American television program at night, there are certain things that are always going to be the same. The program's going to be either a half hour or an hour and a half. You're not going to find a program that's going to be 45 minutes or an hour and 12 minutes because the hour runs on the clock. And you say, of course it does. Well, that's not necessarily the case in other countries. Britain starts programs at 5 after and 10 after and 12 after in some cases. So that's not necessarily a given that a format has to be like. That's what the format is all about. It's a structure. It's how you structure media content. So we're going to finish up with another heady idea here. One of the most famous, I'll call him a cultural economist. He was one of the first people to talk about media not as producing content, but as producing values. We hammered away at this theme in the early part of this course. Media are factories, and they are producing values. Raymond Williams, the famous economic culturalist or cultural economist, he said that what this is all about is national aggrandizement. National aggrandizement. It's creating events that are going to be covered by the media or promoted by the media so that the rest of the world looks at your country and says, wow, that country's really cool or really amazing to look at. And that's what Japan does with its horror films. And that's why you have a country like Mexico choosing to make a mountain really, really cool by calling it Godzilla. I'll just finish up finally with an example of Mexican pottery here to tie things up. I learned last night that this is not just something quaint to look at. Oh, isn't that cute? You're eating on Mexican pot. This is made from clay that has been made by Aztec Mexicans and Mayan Mexicans for centuries. And this can be used on the stove. In fact, our cook last night cooked on plates with the fire right on the stove. It's one of the reasons that Mexico is a heritage site for an intangible contribution, because they have been cooking some foods like the tortilla the same way they do it today as they did it in the 1500s. And you can find the same with Japan and the way that it serves sushi. And that, in fact, is going to be our final comment for today's class. If you know something about Japan, you probably know about its sushi. And is there any meal to eat that's cooler than eating sushi? I don't know. And it finishes up our main thought for the class. Have a great day.